You're listening to the Alpha's love stories, romantic audiobooks that will make your heart race. Don't forget to subscribe for more enchanting love tales. You are never going to believe the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the woman in this story. Imagine for a single, heart-stopping moment, staring into the eyes of a creature born of shadow and legend, a king whose very whisper can command armies and telling him to shut up. That is precisely where our tale begins tonight. But before we step into the silent, sacred halls of the Grand Athenaeum, do me a kindness. Smash that like button and subscribe with notifications on. It truly helps our community thrive and ensures you never miss a moment of the stories to come. I want the comments alive tonight. Tell me where you're listening from, and as you listen, timestamp the moments that make your heart race. Are you ready? Let us begin. In a world where power was measured in decibels, where the strong roared and the weak learned to whisper, Elara was a phantom of silence. She was the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam, the shadow that clung to the bookshelves, the archivist whose voice was softer than the turning of a parchment page. Her life was a carefully composed hymn of quietude, a survival strategy perfected over a lifetime of being overlooked. But every soul, no matter how quiet, has a breaking point. For Elara, it wasn't a battlefield or a shouted insult that shattered her patience. It was a deadline, and a stranger in her library who refused to stop pacing. The Grand Athenaeum was her sanctuary. A cathedral of knowledge where silence was not just a rule, it was a sacred vow. The only sounds were the gentle sigh of ancient stone settling and the soft, rhythmic scratch of her own quill. Here, she was not the invisible Omega, she was the guardian of forgotten stories. But tonight, the silence was fraying. The great obsidian clock chimed the second hour of the morning, a deep, mournful gong that vibrated in her very bones. Elara rubbed her tired eyes, her fingers stained with indigo ink. The High Council's peace treaty needed to be translated and duplicated before dawn, a task of immense delicacy, and she was hopelessly behind. Just as she found her focus, deciphering a critical clause about territorial waters, the sound began again. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy, aggressive footfalls, pacing a relentless rhythm on the marble mezzanine directly above her. For 20 minutes it had gone on, a grating, invasive tattoo that echoed through the vaulted chamber and drilled into her skull. It was the sound of pure, impatient power with no respect for the sanctity it violated. Elara clenched her quill, her knuckles white. She tried to ignore it, to lose herself in the ancient text. Then the pacing stopped. A new sound filled the void, and this one turned her blood to ice. It started as a low, vibrating rumble, not from the air, but from the stone itself. It traveled up the legs of her heavy oak desk, rattled the glass of her lantern. It was a sound that spoke of barely leashed fury, of a primal force scraping against the edges of control. It was the sound of a beast, a predator expressing its displeasure in a language of pure threat. And in that moment, something in Elara simply snapped. The fear, the ingrained obedience, it was burned away by a white-hot wire of sheer, sleep-deprived frustration. This arrogance, this violation of her one safe place was the last straw. Her chair scraped against the floor like a thunderclap. She didn't think. She didn't consider the deadly hierarchy of their world. She only knew this noise had to end, or her work and her sanity would be forever lost. She marched to the spiral staircase, her simple gray woolen skirts whispering around her ankles. The ominous growl grew louder, more intense, as she ascended into the shadows of the restricted section. The air grew thick, charged with a scent of winter pine and cold, sharp metal. At the top, silhouetted against the massive arched window and the moonlight, was the source. A man, though that word seemed too small, he was a mountain of shadow and tension, his back to her, shoulders rigid. The growl was coming from him, a continuous, unsettling vibration. Elara took a final, shaking breath, and then she did the unthinkable. She stomped her foot. The sound, sharp and clear as breaking glass, cut through the animalistic noise. The figure froze. The growling ceased instantly, leaving a silence so profound it was deafening. She crossed her arms, summoning every ounce of authority she possessed as head archivist. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. But in the new quiet, it was absolutely, terrifyingly clear. You will be silent. I do not care who you are or what power you think you hold. This is a place of learning. You will respect it or you will leave. The figure turned slowly. The moonlight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the glint of eyes that were not human but held a molten, gold-ringed fire. He was not just any alpha. The harsh planes of his face were stamped on every coin, every banner in the realm. She had just commanded silence from Kalen Thorne, the Wolf King, the man who had ended wars with a single, well-placed roar. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a look of pure, undiluted shock. It was the look of a god who had just been poked by a mortal. He took one step forward, then another. He loomed over her, his presence swallowing the moonlight. He leaned down, his breath warm against her cheek, his voice a deep, gravelly whisper that promised both danger and something else, something terrifyingly like intrigue. "You wish for my silence, little ghost," he murmured, the words vibrating in her chest. "You have a rare and foolish courage. But commands are for those with the strength to enforce them." He leaned even closer, his lips nearly brushing her ear, and issued a challenge that would change the course of her life forever. "So I ask you this, make me." The silence that followed Alara's command was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating calm before a cataclysm. She could hear her own blood roaring in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the cage of her ribs. She had just signed her own death warrant. She waited for the snap of his temper, for the roar that would bring guards running, for the feel of his claws against her throat, but it never came. King Kalen Thorne simply stared, his head tilted like a wolf observing a rabbit that had just bared its teeth. The predatory fury she'd heard moments before was gone, replaced by a chilling, focused intensity. He circled her slowly, his boots silent on the stone, his gaze scraping over her worn gray dress, her ink-stained fingers, the defiant, terrified set of her jaw. "An Omega," he stated, his voice a low rumble that wasn't quite a question, "in the restricted archives at this hour, ordering me to cease." He stopped in front of her again, a dark, immovable mountain. "Who are you?" Alara forced her chin up, clinging to the remnants of her anger. "I am Alara Vane, head archivist of the Grand Athenaeum, and you, your majesty, are disturbing my work." A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips, though it never reached his burning, gold-flecked eyes. "Your work," he repeated as if the concept was foreign. His gaze flicked to the staircase leading down to her desk, littered with scrolls. The Selenian Concordance, a tedious document full of lies and loopholes. The fact that he knew what she was translating shocked her almost as much as his presence. "It is vital for the peace summit," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "Its accuracy is paramount, and I cannot focus with that noise." He stepped closer, invading every particle of her personal space. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the crisp scent of frost and dark earth. That noise, archivist, is the sound of a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Of fools in silk robes playing at war while the true enemies sharpen their knives in the dark. His voice dropped to a whisper, laden with a weariness that seemed bone-deep. "It is the sound of a king who cannot find a single moment of quiet." For a heartbeat, Alara saw past the crown, past the legend, past the beast. She saw exhaustion etched into the lines beside his eyes, a profound loneliness that echoed in the vast, empty library. The sight disarmed her completely. But the moment shattered as he straightened, the mask of formidable authority slamming back into place. "Your dedication is noted, Alara Vane, as is your unprecedented impertinence." He turned and walked toward the staircase, his earlier agitation seemingly gone. He paused at the top step, not looking back. "Finish your work, the concordance must be flawless." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the depths of the Athenaeum, leaving Alara standing alone in the moonlight, trembling, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. He hadn't punished her. He hadn't even truly threatened her. He had just looked at her, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. She thought that was the end of it. A strange, terrifying encounter with a mad king in the dead of night. She returned to her desk, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her quill. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It felt watchful, charged. She worked until dawn, the words blurring before her eyes, every creak of the ancient building making her jump. She delivered the finished treatise just as the sun rose, then stumbled to her small cot in the archivist's quarters, desperate for oblivion. She slept fitfully, her dreams filled with golden eyes and rumbling growls. She was awakened not by a bell but by a sharp, official rap on her door. Standing in the dim hallway was the steward of the keep, a man whose face usually only frowned upon visiting dignitaries. In his hands was a scroll sealed with black wax, the king's personal seal. "Alara Vane," he intoned, his voice devoid of emotion. "By order of His Majesty, King Caelan Thorn, you are hereby reassigned. Effective immediately, you will serve as the royal chronicler for the duration of the Grand Summit. You are to gather your belongings and present yourself in the king's private study in the North Tower within the hour." He thrust the scroll into her numb hands. The words swam before her eyes: royal chronicler, North Tower, personal authority of the king. This was not a promotion, it was a death sentence dressed in silk. The North Tower was the heart of the wolf's den, surrounded by the most powerful and dangerous alphas of the court. It was the last place an Omega like her could survive. This is a mistake," she stammered, her voice faint. "I am an archivist. I belong here with the scrolls." The steward's eyes were like chips of flint. "There is no mistake, the king was most specific." "He said to tell you," the steward paused, as if the words tasted strange. "He said, the library is too far away, I require the silence to be closer." Alara's blood ran cold, the words from last night thrown back at her with the weight of a royal decree. This was no random act, this was deliberate, he was bringing her to him. She packed her meager possessions in a haze, her mind racing. Was this punishment after all, a cruel game, to place a mouse in a lion's cage and watch the outcome? The walk to the North Tower was a blur of towering stone and hostile stairs. Guards in obsidian armor eyed her with open suspicion. Courtiers in brilliant silks whispered behind their hands, their laughter sharp and mocking. She felt every inch the intruder, the stain on their pristine world of power. The doors to the king's study were made of aged ironwood, taller than two men. They swung open silently. The room within was not what she expected. It was large but Spartan. A massive fireplace held a low fire. A great, scarred table dominated the center, covered not in finery but in maps, troop dispositions, and intercepted missives. This was not a room for ceremony, it was a war room. And at the head of the table, silhouetted against a narrow window, stood Caelan Thorn. He was not looking at her. He was staring at a map, his fist clenched on the tabletop. "You're late," he said, his voice flat, still not turning. Alara clutched her bag. "Your Majesty, I must protest this assignment. I am not a chronicler, I am not a courtier. My skills are with the past, not the present political theater." Now he turned. The morning light showed the harsh lines of his face even more clearly, the shadow of a beard, the relentless focus in his eyes. There was no amusement there now, only a stark, pressing urgency. "Your skills, Alara Vane, are precisely what I require," he said, walking toward her. "You see the truth in dusty words, you hear the lie in a false translation. My court is full of sycophants who tell me what I wish to hear and enemies who weave truth with poison. I need someone who sees only the ink on the page, the fact." He stopped before her. "You wanted the noise to stop. Fine, then you will sit here. You will listen to every meeting, every negotiation, every whispered threat. You will record it, all of it. and you will tell me where the lies are." He leaned in, his voice dropping to that same, intimate, terrifying whisper. "This is not a request, it is a royal command. You will find the quiet for me, chronicler, or I promise you, the noise that follows will shake this fortress to its very foundations." He had not raised his voice, but the threat was absolute. He was not asking for a scribe, he was demanding an anchor. And he had chosen her, the most fragile, impossible candidate in the entire kingdom, to hold the line against the storm raging inside him. The game was set, the mouse was in the lion's den, and the lion's eyes were glowing with a desperate, hungry hope. The first council meeting was a descent into a particularly elegant layer of hell. Ilara was given a small, hard-backed chair in the corner of the cavernous chamber of whispers, a place designed so that even the softest sigh could be heard by all. It was a cruel joke. She was to be both spectator and recorder, a ghost with a quill. She clutched her ledger, a shield of parchment and wood, and kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the grain of the floor. But she could feel them, the stares. They were physical things, like hot brands on her skin. The gathered alphas, leaders of the great packs, generals draped in medals, and nobles dripping with ancestral jewels, all radiated a potent, aggressive energy that made the air thick and hard to breathe. King Kaelin sat upon the obsidian throne at the head of the room, a statue of impenetrable calm. But Ilara, from her angle, could see the tension in the hand resting on the arm of the throne. His knuckles were white, his short, neat claws leaving faint scratches in the stone. The meeting was a delicate dance of venom and velvet. Lord Vesper, a tall alpha with silver hair and a smile like a slit throat, spoke of border security, his words smooth and reasonable. But beneath them, Ilara heard a subtle insistence, a push for more of the king's troops to be placed under his command. General Burrows, a bull of a man built like a fortress wall, argued for preemptive strikes against the mountain clans, his voice a booming drum of war. His arguments were blunt, but they held a dark, compelling logic. And then there was Lady Seraphine. She was not the tallest or the loudest, but she commanded attention like a magnet commands iron. Dressed in deep emerald, her beauty was sharp and cold like a perfectly cut gem. She spoke sparingly, but each word was a needle dipped in honey. She questioned supply lines, proposed alternative treaties, and always, her cool green eyes flickered toward Ilara's corner, lingering with a disdain so profound it felt like a physical chill. Ilara wrote furiously, trying to capture the exact wording, the cadence, the pauses. She saw the patterns Kaelin had spoken of. Lord Vesper's proposals would weaken the central authority. General Burrows's aggression would destabilize the region, creating chaos in which a clever player could seize power. Lady Seraphine's suggestions were masterstrokes of political sabotage disguised as prudent counsel, but she saw something else too, something that made her blood run cold. Small glances exchanged between Vesper and Burrows when the king spoke. A barely perceptible nod from Seraphine toward a quiet, hooded advisor from a southern pack. This was not just disagreement, this was coordination. The tension in the room was a living thing, coiling tighter and tighter. The king's responses grew shorter, sharper. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to emanate from him, a vibration Ilara felt in her teeth more than heard. It was the precursor to the growl from the library. General Burrows, emboldened, slammed a meaty fist on the table. "We must act, Majesty. This diplomacy is the weapon of the weak. It is time to show our fangs." The king's eyes flashed, the gold rings around his pupils seeming to burn. "You presume to tell me when to bare my teeth, General." The words were quiet, but they carried like a crack of ice over a frozen lake. The humming grew louder. Lady Seraphine's lips curved into a faint, pleased smile. This was what she wanted. She wanted the beast to surface in front of them all. To prove the king was unstable, a liability. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the trap closing. If Kaelin roared now, if he gave in to the beast's rage, he would lose everything. the careful alliance would shatter, the summit would end in blood. Without thinking, acting on an instinct she didn't understand, Alara dropped her quill. It was a small sound, a click on the stone floor, but in the tense silence it was startlingly loud. Every eye, including the king's blazing ones, snapped to her corner. Her face flamed, but she did not look down. She met the king's gaze for a single, paralyzing second. Then she bent slowly, deliberately, to retrieve her quill. As she rose, she cleared her throat softly, a mundane human sound. "My apologies, Your Majesty," she said, her voice a thin but clear thread in the heavy air. "The draft from the vent is quite strong. It disrupted my notes on the general's enthusiastic proposal regarding the Eastern Pass. I wish to ensure the record of his troop estimates was accurate before we moved on." She wasn't talking to the king, not really. She was talking to him, to the man buried under the fury. She was offering a lifeline, a boring, administrative, utterly normal lifeline. The king stared at her, the furious glow in his eyes flickered, confused. The humming stopped. He blinked and the predator receded, leaving a man who looked bewildered. He turned his head slowly back to General Burroughs, the moment broken. "Your estimates, General," Kalen said, his voice now cold and controlled, all trace of the beast gone. "You claim you can secure the pass with 500 men. The last intelligence report suggests the Ravagers have doubled their forces there. Explain the discrepancy." The conversation lurched back into tactical, gritty detail. The spell of imminent violence was broken. Lady Seraphine's smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp, reassessing curiosity aimed directly at Alara. The trap had been sprung, and a mouse had somehow tripped the mechanism. After the council, Alara was packing her things, her hands still trembling, when a shadow fell over her table. She looked up into the cool, appraising eyes of Lady Seraphine. "A clumsy archivist," Seraphine murmured, her voice like silk over a razor. "Or a clever one. Tell me, little chronicler, do you make a habit of interrupting the discourse of your betters?" Alara forced herself to stand straight. "I make a habit of ensuring the record is correct, my lady." Inaccuracy in times of peace can be as dangerous as a sword in times of war. Seraphine's eyes narrowed. How philosophical for a keeper of dust. She leaned in slightly, and Alara caught her scent, jasmine and something bitter like crushed almond. "A word of advice, girl. Stray mice in a wolf's court have a very short life expectancy. The king's interest is a fickle thing, and when he grows bored, the wolves will be hungry." She left without another word, leaving Alara frozen, the warning echoing in her mind. She had not imagined the conspiracy. And she had just placed herself squarely in its path. That night, as she tried to work in the small antechamber she'd been given near the king's study, the door opened. Kalen stood there, still in his council robes. He looked exhausted, but the wildness from the chamber was gone. He didn't speak for a long moment, then he said, "The draft from the vent." Alara kept her eyes on her parchment. "Yes, Your Majesty, there is no vent in that corner of the Chamber of Whispers." Her breath hitched, she said nothing. He took a step into the room. "You lied to a king in front of his entire council." Now she looked up, meeting his gaze, a spark of her earlier defiance returning. "I created a diversion, Your Majesty. The record needed correcting." A slow, genuine, and utterly terrifying smile touched his lips. It wasn't cruel, it was amazed. "You saw it, the play, the trap." She nodded once stiffly. He walked to the window, looking out at the darkened fortress. "Lady Seraphine believes the Eastern Pass intelligence is flawed. She provided her own sources, which support the general's optimistic numbers. She is pushing for the deployment." Alara's mind, trained to find patterns in ancient texts, connected the threads instantly. If the intelligence is correct and the Ravagers are stronger, sending only 500 men wouldn't be a defeat. It would be a slaughter. It would weaken your military strength and discredit you as a leader. Kalen turned, his gaze intense. "And if I send too many, I leave the southern border, which borders Vesper's lands, undefended." It is a move designed to cripple me, no matter my choice. The weight of it settled on Alara. This wasn't just recording history. She was standing in the crucible where it was being forged, and the wrong word, the missed nuance, could mean the death of thousands. "You stopped the noise today, chronicler," Kaelin said softly. For a moment, I could think. He studied her, this small, quiet woman who wielded truth like a weapon. "Tomorrow you will not sit in the corner, you will sit at the table. I want you to look them in the eye as they lie to me. I want you to hear it." He left then, closing the door quietly behind him. Alara sank into her chair, her legs giving way. She was no longer just a prisoner in the lion's den. She had been handed a dagger and pushed onto the battlefield. A seat at the table was not a privilege, it was a target. The next morning, when Alara entered the Chamber of Whispers and took the modest chair placed directly to the left of the king's obsidian throne, the silence was more punishing than any roar. Lord Vesper's silver eyebrows climbed his forehead. General Burrose's thick neck flushed a deep, angry red. And Lady Seraphine, she simply smiled, a slow, cold curve of her lips that promised a long and interesting game. Alara kept her eyes on the blank page of her ledger, the weight of their collective gaze like a physical pressure. She felt exposed, raw. The king, however, acted as if her presence was the most natural thing in the world. He began the council without preamble, his voice flat and businesslike. "The matter of the Eastern Pass," Kaelin stated, cutting through the stifling atmosphere. "General Burrose insists his intelligence is sound. Lady Seraphine has provided corroborating reports from her private network." He let the phrase hang, laden with unspoken implication. "I have my own scouts. Their accounts differ significantly." General Burrose puffed up. "With respect, Majesty, your scouts are stationed in the west. They know the mountain clans like they know the bottom of the sea. My men have lived in those crags for generations. We know the Ravager's strength. Do you?" Kaelin's question was a soft dart. "Or do you know what Lady Seraphine's contacts have told you to know?" A ripple of tension went through the room. Seraphine's smile didn't falter, but her green eyes turned to chips of ice. "I merely seek to provide a full picture, Your Majesty. To question my sources is to question my loyalty." "I question everything, my lady," Kaelin replied, his tone leaving no doubt. "It is how I remain king." He turned his head slightly toward Alara, though he didn't look at her. "Chronicler, read back the troop estimates from the general's initial report. And then read the estimates from the scouting report I received last night." Alara's throat went dry. She found the lines, her voice barely more than a whisper at first. Then she forced strength into it, letting the numbers, the stark, contradictory numbers, hang in the air. Burrose claimed 500 Ravagers. The king's scouts reported over 1,500 with siege engines. "A discrepancy of 1,000 souls," Kaelin mused, steepling his fingers. "A mere trifle, wouldn't you say, General? Hardly worth noting." Burrose spluttered, his face purpling. "The scouts are exaggerating. They seek more glory or more funding for their units." Or, interjected a new, smooth voice. Lord Vesper leaned forward, his expression one of concerned wisdom. "Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. 700-800 perhaps, still a formidable force but not insurmountable for our elite troops. A show of strength there would cement our authority." Alara's pen paused. Somewhere in the middle, it was the perfect political answer. It sounded reasonable. It allowed everyone to save face, but it was also a death sentence. Sending even 800 elite troops based on false confidence into an ambush of 1,500, she felt a strange pull, an instinct deeper than fear. She looked up from her ledger, her eyes scanning the faces. Burrose was angry, but there was a flicker in his eyes, not of conviction but of stubborn pride. He didn't want to be wrong. Vesper looked the picture of sagely compromise, but Seraphine was watching Vesper speak, a faint, approving glint in her eye. It was a script and they were following it. Without permission, Alara spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carved through the male posturing like a scalpel. Lord Vesper's suggestion of a middle ground is logically sound, she began, every head swiveled to her. She kept her eyes on her notes as if speaking to the parchment. However, it relies on the assumption that both source reports contain a core of truth. But if one source is intentionally fabricating its numbers, she let the sentence trail off, then finally lifted her gaze not to the king but to Lady Seraphine. Then the mathematical middle is not compromise, it is contamination. It is drinking from a poisoned well and hoping only to get a little sick. The chamber gasped, and Omega, a scribe, had just openly accused a high lady of poisoning information. It was social suicide. It was literal suicide. Seraphine's composure cracked for a single, glorious second. Rage, pure and undiluted, flashed across her beautiful face before she smoothed it into a mask of wounded dignity. "How dare you, you base-born little, enough." The king's voice was a whip crack. He hadn't moved, but his presence seemed to expand, filling the room with a silent, deadly authority. He looked at Alara, his golden eyes blazing with an emotion she couldn't name. The chronicler raises a valid point of logic, one we often overlook in our desire for consensus. He turned his predatory gaze on Seraphine. "My lady, you will provide your original sources for verification by my spy master. Today, General, you will hold your troops. We do not move until we see clearly." The meeting dissolved into tense, hurried formalities. Alara felt dizzy, the adrenaline crashing. She had done it again. She had thrown herself into the path of the avalanche. As the council filed out, Seraphine paused by Alara's chair. She didn't look at her, she stared straight ahead, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for Alara's ears. "You think you are clever, you think you have his favor. You are a candle he is using to read a map in the dark, little mouse, and when the map is read, he will snuff you out without a second thought." Then she was gone, leaving behind the chilling scent of jasmine and bitterness. Alara was packing her things, her hands trembling violently now when a shadow fell across her desk. She expected the king. It was Lord Vesper. "A bold performance, Miss Vane," he said, his voice a silken murmur. "Quite reckless, but then the king has always appreciated novel tools." "I am not a tool, my lord," Alara said, her voice weaker than she wished. "Aren't you?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Let me offer you a different perspective. The king is a storm, powerful, undeniable, but ultimately destructive. Storms pass, the land remains. Align yourself with those who understand the land, my dear, the quiet, steady hands that truly guide the kingdom. A girl of your particular skills could be very valuable and much safer." He placed a small, unmarked scroll on the edge of her desk. "Think on it. The walls have ears, but they also have friends." He left as quietly as he had come. Alara stared at the scroll as if it were a viper. It was an offer, an invitation to betrayal wrapped in promises of safety. This was the game. This was the real war being fought in whispers and shadows, and everyone, it seemed, wanted to claim the king's strange, quiet chronicler for their own side. That night, in the solitude of her chamber, she stared at the unopened scroll. The king's warning echoed in her mind, "You will tell me where the lies are." But what if the lies were now being offered directly to her? What if the truth was no longer something to be found in transcripts, but a path she had to choose? She had come here to find quiet. Instead, she had found herself at the roaring center of a silent, deadly storm. And she had just made an enemy of the most dangerous woman in the kingdom and been courted by its most subtle snake. The mouse was learning a terrible, new truth. In the wolf's den, sometimes the quietest pause left the deepest scars. The unmarked scroll sat on Alara's small writing desk for 2 days. It was a mute accusation, a silent question. She didn't touch it. She couldn't bring herself to open it, yet throwing it into the fire felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. It was a seed of treason, and she refused to water it with her curiosity. Instead, she poured herself into her work with a frantic intensity. She cross-referenced old trade ledgers with current border reports, searching for the discrepancies the king sensed. The dry columns of numbers and goods became a landscape, and in them she began to see faint, troubling trails, small shipments of forged steel reported as farming tools. Shipments of medicinal herbs that in certain combinations could be used for darker purposes. They were whispers of preparation, not for war but for something more insidious. King Kalen left her largely to her own devices, a brooding, restless presence in the study beyond her open door. He spent hours staring at maps, his fingers tracing invisible lines of conflict. The low, agitated hum she'd come to recognize as the beast stirring beneath his skin was a near-constant backdrop. It was the sound of a mind racing down too many dark paths at once. On the third day, he finally spoke to her directly. He didn't enter her room. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the firelight from his study. "You have been quiet, chronicler, even for you." Alara didn't look up from a centuries-old ledger on mineral rights. "I am searching for the source of the draft, Your Majesty, not the one in the council chamber, the one that is chilling your borders." He was silent for a long moment. "And have you found it?" "I have found dampness," she said carefully, tapping a line in the ledger. "Unexplained shortages here, unexplained surpluses there, like someone is moving the pieces on a board I cannot see." He came into the room then, moving with that silent, predatory grace. He leaned over her shoulder to look at the ledger, his presence overwhelming. She caught his scent, frost and iron, and beneath it the sharp, clean smell of a winter storm. "The board is the kingdom, Alara Vane. The pieces are men, gold, and weapons. The game is my throne." He pointed a blunt finger at a record of a mine in the Ironroot Mountains. This yielded nothing for a decade, then 3 years ago modest quantities. Now it is reportedly exhausted again. "A typical lifespan for a small vein," Alara offered, "is it?" Kalen's voice was grim. "My father's chief surveyor wrote a private memoir. He believed the Ironroot lode was the largest in the continent. He disappeared before he could file his official report. The mine was declared played out 6 months later." A chill that had nothing to do with any draft crept down Alara's spine. "You believe the mine is still producing, in secret?" "I believe someone is harvesting its teeth to fashion a bite meant for me," he growled softly. He straightened, pacing the small space. "Vesper's lands border the Ironroots. Seraphine's southern allies have the best metalworkers. Burroughs commands the regiments that would be first to respond to any disturbance in that region." The pieces, the damp trails she'd found, began to click together into a terrifying picture. It wasn't just a coup. It was a slow, patient strangulation. They were building an army right under his nose, using his own kingdom's resources. "They are waiting for you to make a mistake," Alara breathed, understanding dawning. "Like sending troops to the wrong pass, like losing your temper in council. They need you to look weak, unstable, so their rebellion seems justified." Kalen stopped pacing and looked at her, a fierce, approving light in his golden eyes. "Yes, they need a catalyst, a spark to light the kindling they have been gathering for years." He walked to her desk and saw the unmarked scroll. His expression hardened into something deadly. "And they are now looking for new tinder. What is this?" Alara's heart seized. "Lord Vesper, he left it after the last council, and you did not bring it to me." The question was lethally quiet. "I did not open it," she said, meeting his gaze, her own defiance sparking. "I am your chronicler, not your spy. My duty is to the record, not to carry secret messages between conspirators. Bringing you an unopened scroll from a traitor proves nothing but that I received it. Opening it would make me part of the conversation." He stared at her, and for a moment she saw the beast again, the fury at being kept in the dark. Then remarkably it faded, replaced by a grudging, weary respect. "You have a diplomat's cunning hidden under all that librarian's dust." He picked up the scroll. "You are right, this is not your war to fight with such weapons." He broke the seal, a blank disk of wax, and unfurled the parchment. His eyes scanned the contents, his face becoming an unreadable mask of stone. Without a word, he handed it to her. The message inside was short, written in a precise, elegant hand. The storm isolates the peak, making it vulnerable. The quiet anchor, however, need not share its fate. A sheltered harbor exists for those who can read the true stars. Consider your position, the tide is turning. It was poetry, it was metaphor. And it was a crystal-clear offer. The king is alone and in danger. You do not have to go down with him. Join us and we will protect you. Your skills are needed. Alara looked up, her mouth dry. It's not proof of anything. It is proof of everything, Kalen corrected, his voice a low rumble. It is proof they are moving, that they see you as a weakness to be exploited or a weapon to be acquired. They fear what you help me see. He took the scroll back and held it over the flame of her candle. The edges blackened, curled, and ignited. Let them wonder which it is to be. He watched it burn to ash in a small brass dish. We need the map, Alara. Not the map they are drawing for us with its false passes and poison middles. We need their map, the one that shows the mine, the forges, the troop caches. How, she whispered, the enormity of the task settling on her. They are careful. But they are also arrogant, Kalen said, a plan forming in his eyes. They keep records. Men like Vesper cannot help it. They need to know what they own, what they are owed. It will be hidden, likely in plain sight, a ledger that looks like something else. A history that isn't about the past. He looked at her and the weight of his trust was heavier than any crown. You are the only one in this fortress who can look at a book and see the story hidden between the lines. Find it, chronicler. Find their true ledger before their spark finds its kindling. He left her then, with the ashes of treason on her desk and an impossible mission in her hands. The quiet of the room was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a deep, dark forest where every rustle of parchment, every scratch of her quill, felt like a step that could trigger a hidden snare. She was no longer just recording history or even deciphering lies. She had been tasked with stealing the enemy's blueprint for revolution, and she had to do it using the only weapons she possessed: silence, patience, and the profound, terrifying ability to truly see. The mouse was no longer just avoiding the lions. She had been asked to find the lion's den, count its cubs, and draw a map for the hunter, and the hunter's hungry, golden eyes were waiting. The hunt began in the only place Alara knew, the Grand Athenaeum. It felt like a lifetime since she had left, though it had only been days. The familiar scent of dust, parchment, and aged leather was a balm to her frayed nerves, but it was a haunted homecoming. She was no longer just its guardian, she was a thief in its halls, searching for a secret that could get her killed. King Kalen had given her a pretext to retrieve essential historical references for the summit's final accords. It allowed her free rein, but it also painted a target on her back. She felt the eyes of the other archivists, her former colleagues, following her with a mixture of jealousy, pity, and suspicion. The mouse had gone to the tower, and she had returned smelling of wolf and power. She started not with the restricted section but with the public ledgers, estate inventories, trade guild records, public tax rolls. She was looking for a pattern of obfuscation. If Vesper was hiding the output of the Ironroot mine, the wealth had to go somewhere. It couldn't just vanish. For hours she lost herself in the monotonous poetry of numbers. Her world narrowed to columns of figures, the sound of her own breathing, the soft shush of a turning page. It was a meditation, and in that deep focus the first anomaly appeared. It was in the annual yield report for the Silverwood Mercantile Concern, a trading company owned by a minor noble in Vesper's domain. The numbers were too perfect. The profits increased by a steady, unvarying 5% each year, regardless of drought, war, or plague. In the real, chaotic world of trade, such consistency was not a sign of good management, it was a sign of fiction. The books were cooked, she traced the concern's holdings. It owned warehouses, ships, and her breath hitched, a defunct smelter near the Ironroot foothills, officially mothballed. But the company's fuel costs listed under logistical overhead were substantial and constant. Why pay to heat a building that wasn't operating? A cold thread of excitement shot through her. This was a thread, she pulled it. Following the financial trail was like navigating a maze made of smoke. Companies owned by other companies based in distant city-states, loans that circled back on themselves. It was a masterclass in hiding wealth, but Alara's mind, trained to follow the lineage of kings through contradictory chronicles, was uniquely suited to the task. She saw not the walls of the maze but the subtle wear on the floor from one oft-traveled path. The path led inevitably back to culture, to art. She found herself in the section dedicated to acquisitions and donations. Here, among records of gifted tapestries and purchased sculptures, was Vesper's true genius. He was a renowned patron of the arts. He donated lavishly to museums, funded struggling painters, and collected rare, obscure historical manuscripts from across the realm. It was the hobby of a sophisticated, benevolent lord. Alara pulled the ledger for his most recent philanthropic endeavor, the Vesper collection of antique cartography, a priceless gift to the royal archives themselves. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, detailed invoices from parchment makers, ink specialists, master binders. Payments for acquisition fees and restoration costs for maps of places that no longer existed, borders that had shifted centuries ago. One entry, dated 8 months prior, snagged her eye like a hook. Item: Regional Survey of the Eastern Iron Root Valleys, circa 312 AE copy. Acquired from private collector Ravenspire authentication fee, paid to master cartographer Valerius restoration and binding, 50 gold crowns notes severely foxed and water damaged, requires extensive reconstitution of faded ink. 50 gold crowns to restore a single damaged copy of a common regional survey. It was an absurd sum, a fortune. Hidden in plain sight in the most innocent of places, a donation receipt. Alara's heart began to pound a frantic rhythm. She needed to see that map. The Vesper collection was housed in a new, climate-controlled wing, courtesy of the Lord's generosity. It was late, the wing was deserted, lit only by the moon through high, slender windows. The collection was displayed in a series of locked, glass-topped cases. The Eastern Iron Root map was in the last case. It looked every bit the ancient relic: yellowed parchment, faded brown ink, splotches of foxing, deliberate-looking water stains obscuring whole sections. To any casual observer it was worthless, but Alara was not a casual observer. She was looking for a lie. She leaned close, her nose almost touching the glass. The water damage was odd. It formed a pattern, a loose, wobbly circle that obscured the central mountain range. The foxing, the speckled brown spots, clustered not randomly, but along specific, invisible lines that, if she squinted, looked like old roads or modern mining tunnels. Her breath fogged the glass. This wasn't a damaged historical map. It was a brand new map, artfully damaged to hide its true purpose. The faded ink that needed reconstitution was the key. Under the right light, with the right chemical reagent, the true markings would emerge. The restoration fee wasn't for fixing it. It was for paying the cartographer to create the perfect hiding place. This was the ledger, this was their map. A floorboard creaked behind her. Alara froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She hadn't heard anyone enter. Slowly, she turned. Lady Seraphine stood in the doorway, draped in a cloak of deep blue, her face pale in the moonlight. She wasn't smiling. "The diligent chronicler," Seraphine murmured, her voice echoing softly in the empty hall, "working so late and so far from the king's side. Did his warmth grow cold so quickly? I am researching territorial histories for the Accords, my lady," Alara said, forcing her voice to steadiness. She subtly shifted her body, blocking the view of the map case. "Of course you are." Seraphine glided forward, her steps silent. Her eyes, however, were not on Alara's face. They were scanning the case behind her, the specific ledger open on a nearby stand. territorial histories, such a vital, dry subject. Tell me, do you find the old maps revealing? They show us where we have been, Alara said carefully. Not always where we are going, a wise answer. Seraphine stopped an arm's length away. The scent of jasmine was cloying in the still air. But sometimes the past holds the key to the future, a hidden spring, a lost trail. A vein of ore everyone has forgotten, she let the word hang. Almost everyone. Alara's mouth was dry as dust. She knew, Seraphine knew what she was looking at. The king uses you to see, little ghost, Seraphine whispered, leaning in, but who helps you see? You are staring at the puzzle, but do you have the key to unlock it, the reagent to make the invisible visible? Her green eyes glittered. Or are you just staring at a pretty piece of spoiled parchment? It was a threat and an offer wrapped in the same elegant package. I know what you found, I know what you need to read it, and I have it. Before Alara could respond, Seraphine's head tilted as if hearing a distant sound. A faint, genuine flicker of irritation crossed her face. It seems your shadow is longer than I thought. Until next time, chronicler. Remember, some secrets are better left faded, for your health. She melted back into the shadows of the doorway and was gone. Alara stood trembling, clutching the edge of the display case for support. She had found the map, but Seraphine had found her, and now the silent hunt had become a deadly race. She had the location of the treasure, but her most dangerous enemy held the key to the lock. The ghost in the archives had been seen, and the wolves were now on her trail. The fortress felt different after that night in the archives. The stones themselves seemed to watch her. Every servant's averted gaze felt calculated, every guard's neutral expression a mask. Seraphine's whispered warning was a poison ivy, its roots threading through Alara's thoughts, making her jump at shadows. She had the map, but without the key it was just a piece of dangerous art, and Seraphine knew she had it. King Kalen noticed her tension. He said nothing for a day, observing her with those unnerving golden eyes as she tried and failed to concentrate on transcribing bland trade agreements. The low, protective hum that often emanated from him when she was near grew more persistent, a constant vibration in the air between them. Finally, on the second evening, he spoke. He was sharpening a dagger, the rhythmic shh-hick of steel on stone filling the study. "You've found something." It wasn't a question. Alara's quill paused. She stared at the parchment, the ink pooling into a tiny black star. "I found a ledger that isn't a ledger, a map that isn't a map." The sharpening stopped. "Where?" "The Vesper collection, in the Athenaeum itself, a damaged survey of the Ironroot valleys. The damage is a forgery. The restoration costs were the payment to hide the real information on it. It's their blueprint." Kalen was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously calm. "You went into a viper's nest alone." "I had the pretext you gave me," she defended, a spark of her old defiance flaring, "and you were followed or anticipated." He stood, sheathing the dagger. "Seraphine." Alara nodded, a shiver tracing her spine. "She as much as told me she has the means to reveal the true markings, the key." A muscle ticked in Kalen's jaw. "Then we are at an impasse. We have the lock, she has the key, and she knows we are at the door." He began to pace, a caged wolf. "She will not give it up. She will use it as leverage, or she will destroy it to keep the secret." "There might be another way," Alara said slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. "We don't need the key she has, we need to understand what the key is. It's a reagent, a chemical, something a master cartographer or a forger would use. It's not magic, it's knowledge." She stood up, her mind racing, leaving the world of politics and entering her own domain of research. "We find Master Valerius, the cartographer named on the acquisition record, the one paid the authentication fee. If he created the hidden layer, he knows how to reveal it. Or he knows who supplied the materials." Kalen's eyes lit with a fierce, predatory hope. "Valerius is old, retired. He lives in the artisan's quarter under Vesper's protection. Getting to him will be like taking a bone from a sleeping dragon." But you are the dragon slayer, are you not? The words were out before she could stop them. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a true, unguarded smile touch his lips. It transformed his harsh face, making him look younger, almost approachable. We shall see, chronicler, we shall see. The plan was simple and terrifying. They could not go as king and chronicler. Kaelin would be recognized instantly. Alara would be marked as his creature. They needed to be ghosts. 2 nights later, Alara found herself wrapped in a coarse, hooded woolen cloak that smelled of horses and hay. Kaelin wore the worn leathers of a guardsman, his regal bearing slumped into a convincing semblance of weary boredom. They slipped from a postern gate used for refuse into the winding, foul-smelling alleys of the lower city. The journey was a nightmare of tension. Every shout, every barking dog made Alara flinch. Kaelin moved like a shadow, his hand never far from the dagger at his belt, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, protecting. He didn't speak, but his presence was a solid wall at her back. Master Valerius's workshop was a shabby building leaning against the city wall. A single, grimy window showed no light. Kaelin tried the door. Locked. With a glance up and down the empty alley, he drew his dagger, worked it into the gap, and with a sharp twist and a muted crack, the lock gave way. The inside was a chaos of parchment, copper plates, and chemical bottles. An old man slept in a chair by a dead hearth, wrapped in a blanket. He startled awake as Kaelin closed the door, his eyes wide with fear in the dim light from a street lamp outside. "Please, I have nothing, Master Valerius," Kaelin said, his voice low but dropping all pretense. It was the voice of command of the throne room. The old man's eyes widened further, recognizing the tone if not the face. "You were paid to authenticate and restore a map for Lord Vesper." "The Ironroot Survey, we are not here to harm you, we need to know how to reveal the hidden work." Valerius trembled, his gaze darting between the 2 hooded figures. I don't know what you, 50 gold crowns, Alara said softly, stepping forward. She lowered her hood slightly, letting the old man see her face, not a thug S but a scholar S, for reconstitution of faded ink. "That is not restoration, that is creation. You are a master, you didn't just authenticate it, you made the hidden layer. What reagent reveals it? Silver nitrate." Gallic acid, the use of the technical terms broke through his fear. He blinked at her, his professional pride piqued even in his terror. A special preparation, not common, made from the lichen that grows only on the north face of the iron roots themselves, Xanthoria aureophila. "It reacts with the iron gall ink I used for the underdrawing, washes away the false stains, leaves the true lines a vivid blue." Alara's mind seized the information. Lichen, specific, rare, traceable. Where would one get this preparation now? Valerius swallowed. "I used the last of my stock. The only other person who would have it is the patron who commissioned the special ink years ago for other, discreet works." Kaelin leaned in. "Who?" The old cartographer shrunk back. "She will kill me." "She will never know you spoke," Kaelin growled, the promise dark and absolute. Tears welled in Valerius's eyes. "The Lady Seraphine. She provided the base lichen extract. She has always had an interest in hidden knowledge." There it was, the confirmation. Seraphine wasn't just a conspirator, she was the archivist of the conspiracy, the keeper of its secrets. She held the key because she had commissioned the lock. They left the old man with a bag of silver coins and a warning of silence that needed no words. The journey back through the sleeping city was even more tense. They had what they needed, but the knowledge was a burning coal. Seraphine was the linchpin. As they slipped back into the postern gate, the first gray light of dawn tinting the sky, Kaelin stopped her in the deserted lower corridor. He pushed back his hood, his face grim in the half-light. "She has the reagent, she knows we need it. She will expect us to come for it or to try to recreate it, which would take weeks we don't have." He looked down at Alara, his expression unreadable. "There is another way, a direct way, but it places you in the cage with the viper." Alara's heart thudded against her ribs. "What way?" We give her what she wants, Kalen said, his voice a low rumble. Not the map, she already knows we have that. We give her a greater prize. We let her believe she has turned the king's chronicler. We let her believe you are her key into my confidence. The plan was breathtakingly audacious and suicidal. Ilara would have to pretend to betray the king to accept Seraphine's earlier offer to become a double agent. She would have to lie to the most dangerous liar in the realm. I am not a spy, she whispered, her voice shaking. You are the only one she might believe, Kalen said, his gaze intense. Because you are the only one I have trusted, she has seen it. She will think your fear, your sense of self-preservation, has finally overcome your loyalty. She will think she has won. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek but not touching it, a gesture of shocking vulnerability from the Wolf King. I cannot order you to do this. The cage will be of your own choosing. Say no, and we will find another path, however long it takes. Say yes, and you will walk into the darkness alone. I will be watching, but I may not be able to reach you in time. Ilara looked into his eyes, seeing the storm of conflict there, the king who needed to win and the man who feared sending her into the abyss. The library, the council, the map, the key, it had all led to this precipice. She thought of the quiet she had once craved. It was gone forever. In its place was this roaring, terrifying, vital purpose. She took a deep, shuddering breath and made her choice. Tell me what to do. The performance began with silence. Ilara stopped attending the council meetings. She took her meals alone in her chamber, sending them back barely touched. She let the shadows under her eyes darken, let a palpable aura of frayed nerves and sleepless anxiety cling to her. She was a portrait of someone drowning. She knew she was being watched. Not just by Kalen's hidden eyes, but by Seraphine's. The lady's network of whispers was legendary, so Ilara planted the seeds herself. She had a tearful, hushed argument with the king's steward about impossible demands within earshot of a maid known to carry tales. She accidentally spilled ink over a week's worth of summit notes and was heard sobbing in frustration. She was a dam about to break, and she waited for the viper to come to drink. It happened in the one place she felt most vulnerable, the royal baths. A secluded, steamy cavern of natural hot springs, where titles and armor were left at the door. Ilara was alone, submerged to her shoulders in the milky, mineral-rich water, trying to wash the tension from her bones, when the gentle sound of another entering the pool made her open her eyes. Lady Seraphine slid into the water opposite her, her pale skin gleaming, her dark hair piled high. She looked like a water nymph from an old tale, beautiful and utterly perilous. Such a weight you carry, little chronicler, Seraphine murmured, her voice echoing softly off the stone. It is too heavy for such narrow shoulders. Ilara said nothing, just looked down at the swirling water, letting her exhaustion show. I hear things, Seraphine continued, idly tracing a pattern on the surface, that the king's temper grows shorter, that his reliance on you has become a chain. That you are trapped in a tower with a storm that is bound to break. She leaned forward slightly. Storms break things, Ilara, delicate things first. He is not a storm, Ilara whispered, the lie tasting like ash. He is a king, and my duty is to him. But she made her voice waver, made it sound like a mantra she was struggling to believe. Seraphine's smile was a gentle, pitying curve. Duty, a noble word, but does your duty require your destruction? He sees you as a tool, a fascinating, useful tool. But when a tool is worn down or a more interesting one is found, she let the implication hang in the steam. What is your duty to yourself? Ilara lifted her gaze, allowing a shimmer of desperate tears to film her eyes. What choice do I have? Ah, Seraphine breathed, her own eyes lighting with a hunter's glee. There is always a choice, the choice to be wise, to see the current of the tide and to swim with it, not against it. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He is isolated, Ilara. The generals doubt him, the Lord's plot. His own beast is a liability he can no longer control. He is a king sitting on a throne of cracking ice, and he has you standing right beside him." She reached out, her hand cool as it brushed a strand of wet hair from Alara's forehead. The gesture was almost maternal and infinitely more terrifying for it. "I do not offer you betrayal, I offer you survival. I offer you a place of safety, of respect, where your mind is valued, not just your ability to quiet a monster's growl. Help us ensure a smooth transition. Help us avoid the bloodshed his stubbornness will inevitably bring. Be our eyes where we cannot see. And when the new dawn comes, you will have a place of honor. You will be the guardian of a new, stable kingdom, not a prisoner in a doomed man's study." It was the offer from the scroll made flesh and voice. It was seductive in its cold logic. It preyed on every fear Alara had felt since being dragged to the tower. Alara let a single tear trace a path down her cheek. It wasn't entirely an act, the fear was real. "What would you have me do?" "Nothing tonight," Seraphine said, withdrawing her hand. "Just think. Consider the harbor from the storm. When you are ready, leave a single white feather on the ledge of your window, a sign of peace, a sign of wisdom, and then we will show you how to truly be silent." With that, she rose from the water, a vision of elegant power, and left Alara alone in the swirling steam, the words "truly be silent" echoing with a dread finality. The next day was agony. Alara moved through her tasks like a ghost, her mind screaming with the enormity of the charade. She avoided the king entirely, the guilt a physical pain. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples, she stood at her narrow window, a small, downy white feather, plucked from a discarded pillow, pinched between her fingers. This was the point of no return. Once this feather was placed, she would be a traitor in the eyes of every loyal subject. She would be in the viper's nest for real. She thought of Kaelin's face in the dawn corridor. "I may not be able to reach you in time." With a trembling hand, she placed the feather on the cold stone ledge. It was immediately caught by a gust of wind, tumbling end over end into the darkening courtyard below. It was done. The wait was short. Just after the midnight bell, a soft tap 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 came at her door. Not the king's firm rap, this was furtive. When she opened it, no one was there, but on the floor lay a small, unassuming pottery jar, the kind used for face creams or salves. There was no note. Alara brought it inside, her heart hammering. She opened it. Inside was a thick, clear gel, odorless, the reagent, the key to the map, Seraphine's first test of trust and her first leash. By accepting it, Alara was accepting the next step. She took the jar and hid it within a hollowed-out book. She had the key. Now she had to use it and pass the information not to Seraphine but to the king. She was now a conduit flowing with poison, and she had to filter the truth without being consumed. 2 days later, a summons came, not from the king, but from Lady Seraphine. An invitation to afternoon tea in her sun-drenched private salon, a social call, a trap. The room was a masterpiece of subtle power, full of light, rare blooming flowers, and exquisite art. Seraphine was the picture of relaxed hospitality. "Thank you for coming, my dear," she said, pouring fragrant tea. "I hoped you might appreciate a moment of calm. How are you finding your new perspective?" "It is a relief," Alara said carefully, stirring her tea, "to not feel the tension constantly." Indeed, Seraphine's green eyes were sharp, now to practical matters. "That old map you were so interested in, the damaged one, a curious piece, have you had any further thoughts on it?" Alara sipped her tea, buying time. "I believe its value is still hidden, but I lack the expertise to reveal it." "A shame," Seraphine sighed. "Perhaps it is for the best. Some histories are meant to stay buried. Let us speak of more current events. The king is meeting with the merchant guilds tomorrow, a discussion on wartime tariffs, a dry subject but vital for logistics. I would be so interested in his tone. Is he confrontational, or is he resigned?" The question was not idle, it was a probe. She wanted to know if Kaelin was feeling the pressure, if he was becoming unpredictable. Alara set her cup down with a faint click. "He is determined." But determination can look like desperation when the walls are closing in. She met Seraphine's gaze. He trusts my record, but he does not trust my counsel. He still sees the librarian. Seraphine's smile was triumphant. Then we must make you more than a librarian. We must make you indispensable. Continue your good work, Elara. Watch, listen, and remember the harbor is waiting. Elara left the salon, the sweet taste of tea turning to metal in her mouth. She had passed the first test. She had given a morsel of truth wrapped in the implication of Kaelin's instability, and she had kept the reagent's existence a secret. That night, in the absolute blackness of the late hours, she slipped into the king's study. He was there, a silhouette by the dead fireplace. Without a word, she placed the small pottery jar on his desk. "He has the map. She has given me the key to read it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She wants a report on your meeting with the guilds. She is gauging your resolve." Kaelin picked up the jar, holding it as if it were a live coal. "And what will you tell her?" "The truth," Elara said, her fear crystallizing into a cold, sharp purpose. "That you are determined, unyielding, a king who will not bend." It is what she wants to hear. It confirms her belief that you are inflexible, ripe for breaking. He looked at her, and in the darkness she saw the gleam of his teeth in something that was not a smile. "Then we shall give her a performance. And you, chronicler, will give her just enough truth to make the lie believable." The mouse was in the viper's nest, but she was not alone, and she was no longer a mouse. She was a secret, a hidden stitch in the fabric of a coming war, holding two sides together even as she prepared to help one tear the other apart. The silence she now kept was the most deafening sound in the fortress. The game became a dance on a knife's edge. Elara lived two lives, and each breath felt like a lie. By day, she was the increasingly strained chronicler, her notes for the king detailed and sharp, often containing subtle questions in the margins. Lord Vesper emphasized grain stores here, but the southern harvest failed. Why the push for surplus? By night, she was the tentative ally of the rebellion, meeting Seraphine's discreet contacts in shadowed corners, passing tidbits of information that were true but incomplete. She told them the king was fixated on the mountain clans, a truth that made them complacent about their southern operations. She reported his irritation with the merchant guilds, which they interpreted as financial desperation. She was painting a portrait of a man on the defensive, blind to the true threat, and Kaelin played his part flawlessly. In council, he was brusque, his temper flaring over minor disputes, his focus seemingly scattered between the Eastern Pass and Northern trade disputes. He publicly berated General Burroughs for lax drills, then turned around and ignored Vesper's pointed questions about troop deployments in the South. He was the volatile, distracted monarch they wanted him to be. The only time the mask slipped was in the absolute privacy of his study, late at night. There, he was a creature of fierce, focused intensity. With the reagent, they had uncovered the map's true layer. Etched in vivid blue were not just mining tunnels, but armories, forges disguised as textile mills, and mustering points in remote valleys. It was the skeleton of a shadow army. "They have been building this for 5 years at least," Kaelin growled, tracing a line of blue that snaked toward the capital. "They don't just want the throne, they want to replace the entire structure. Seraphine's smooth transition is a purge." Elara, cross-referencing the map with legitimate tax and land records, felt a deeper chill. "It's not just military. Look, these warehouses near the river, they're on land officially designated for floodplain, unusable. But the property taxes are being paid by a shell company linked to Vesper's Silverwood concern. They're stockpiling supplies where no one would look." Kaelin leaned over her shoulder, his presence a warm, solid wall against the horror they were uncovering. "How do you see these things?" "I look for the story the numbers don't want to tell," she said quietly, her finger resting on another anomaly. "This village, population has dropped by half in 3 years. Official record says migration to cities, but the city census shows no influx from this region. Where did the people go? He went very still. Conscription or worse. He straightened, his face grim. We have the map, we know their strength, their locations, but moving against them now would be civil war. They would cry tyranny, and with the evidence hidden, many would believe them. We need the spark, but we need it to come from them. We need them to reveal their hand. The summit's closing ceremony, Alara said, the idea forming. All the dignitaries, all the packs gathered. It's the perfect moment for a dramatic gesture. If they believe you are at your weakest, most isolated, they will strike, Kalen finished, his eyes gleaming with a lethal light. They will try to force my abdication in front of the entire realm, to justify their coup. He began to pace. We need to let them think their moment has come. We need to give them an opportunity they cannot resist. The plan was a tapestry of risk, woven with threads of deception. Kalen would announce a surprise review of the southern garrisons after the summit, pulling key loyal regiments away from the capital. It was the perfect pretext for the conspirators to act, believing the city would be undefended. Alara's role was the most delicate. She had to convince Seraphine that the king's decision was one of panic, not strategy, that he was fleeing potential unrest in the capital, a cowardly move that would seal his fate in the eyes of the other alphas. She requested another private tea with the lady. This time the atmosphere was different, the pleasantries were shorter. Seraphine's elegant facade was thinned by a wire-taut anticipation. You look troubled, Alara. The king, he is not well, Alara whispered, letting her hands shake slightly as she set down her cup. The pressure, he speaks in circles. He's given orders that make no sense. Seraphine leaned forward, a predator sensing weakness. What orders? He's pulling the Iron Guard and the Storm Falcons out of the city, right after the summit. He says it's for a southern review, but Alara looked around furtively as if afraid the walls were listening. He told me to pack the most sensitive treaties, as if he does not plan to return. The lie was a masterstroke. It painted a picture of a king preparing to abandon his throne, saving what he could. Seraphine's breath caught, her eyes glowed with a fierce, unholy joy. This was it, the capitulation they had been waiting for. When, she demanded, her voice hushed. The regiments move at dawn, 2 days after the ceremony. He leaves at noon the same day. Alara delivered the false timeline, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every word felt like a betrayal, even though it was a carefully crafted fiction. Seraphine sat back, a serene, victorious smile gracing her lips. You have done well, my dear, better than you know. The harbor is closer than ever. She reached into a small, ornate box on the table and pulled out a delicate silver chain with a single, teardrop-shaped moonstone. A small token for your loyalty. Wear it at the closing ceremony. It will let friends know you are under our protection. Alara took the necklace. The stone was cold, beautiful, and felt like a collar, a brand. She had passed the final test. She was in. As she left, her fingers closed around the moonstone. It was not just a signal to the conspirators. It was her signal to Kalen. The trap was set. The Viper was moving into position. The night before the closing ceremony, Alara couldn't sleep. The weight of the coming day was a physical pressure on her chest. She slipped from her room and found herself drawn to the one place that had always been hers, a high, secluded balcony of the library, open to the stars. She wasn't alone. Kalen stood at the balustrade, his hands braced on the stone, looking out over the sleeping city. He didn't turn as she approached. You should be resting, he said, his voice quiet. I couldn't. He nodded as if he understood perfectly. The silence between them was comfortable for the first time. It wasn't the silence of fear or strategy. It was the quiet of two people standing before a storm. Tomorrow, he said finally, it ends or it begins. Are you afraid? The question escaped her before she could stop it. He turned his head to look at her. In the starlight, his face was all harsh angles and shadows, but his eyes were clear. I am always afraid. Fear is the whetstone, it keeps the edge sharp. He looked back at the city, but this fear is different. It is not for the throne. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The unspoken words hung in the air. It is for you. Alara's throat tightened. She moved to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of him, to smell the frost and iron scent that was uniquely his. I am afraid too, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, but not of them. I am afraid that when the noise finally stops, I won't know what to listen for anymore. He turned fully to face her then, his gaze intense, searching her face as if memorizing it. Then you will learn, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet night. You will learn to listen to the peace, and I will learn to be still enough to hear it with you. It was a promise. A fragile, impossible promise made on the eve of battle. It was a vision of a future that depended entirely on surviving the next day. He reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair the night wind had loosened from her braid. The touch was fleeting, gentler than she ever thought him capable of. Wear the necklace tomorrow, Alara Vane, and remember, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you are not alone. The quiet you gave me, it is my strength now, it will see us through. He left her then, melting back into the darkness of the tower. Alara stood alone under the vast, cold stars, her fingers pressed to the spot on her cheek where his touch had lingered. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, kindled by his words, was a new, fierce warmth, a resolve. Tomorrow the unseen war would become visible. Tomorrow the silent dance would end in a roar. And she, the quiet archivist, would be standing at the center of it all, not as a pawn, but as the keeper of the secret that would decide the fate of a kingdom. The moonstone around her neck felt less like a collar now and more like a lodestone, pulling her toward a destiny she had never asked for but would now see through to the end. Dawn broke not with light but with a thick, gray silence that smothered the fortress. It was the quiet before an execution. Alara dressed with mechanical precision, her fingers cold and clumsy as she fastened the silver chain with its moonstone teardrop around her neck. It lay against her skin like a shard of ice, a constant, chilling reminder of the role she had to play. The great hall had been transformed, no longer a chamber for whispered politics, it was a stage for power. Banners of every major house hung from the soaring rafters. The air was thick with the scent of incense, polished metal, and the potent, mixed pheromones of hundreds of the realm's most powerful alphas. The noise was a low, threatening hum, not the growl of beasts but the murmur of a tide about to turn. Alara took her assigned seat not at the high table but at a scribe station to the right of the dais, a position of visibility. Her ledger was open, her inks ready. She was a prop in the scene, and everyone knew it. She kept her eyes down, but her senses were stretched taut, absorbing everything. King Kalen entered last. He did not stride. He flowed into the hall, a study in controlled majesty. He wore the formal black and silver of his house, the obsidian crown resting on his brow like a piece of the night sky made solid. His face was a mask of regal indifference, but Alara, from her angle, saw the tightness around his eyes, the faint pulse in his jaw. He was a bowstring drawn to its limit. The ceremony began with tedious formalities, speeches praising the peace, the reading of bland passages from the newly signed accords. Alara recorded it all, her script steady, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She felt the weight of specific stares, Seraphine's cool, assessing gaze from the high table, Lord Vesper's avuncular smile that didn't reach his eyes, General Barros's impatient, glowering presence. Then, as the master of ceremonies droned on about a new era of prosperity, Lord Vesper rose. A respectful hush fell. This was unexpected. Your Majesty, honored assemblies, Vesper began, his voice a model of resonant, reasonable tone. While we celebrate peace, let us not be lulled into forgetting the strength that secures it. A king's might is the kingdom's shield. Yet a shield must be held by a steady, unwavering hand. He paused, letting the words settle. The hall was utterly silent. This was the opening move. Recent days have seen uncertainties, Vesper continued, his gaze sweeping the room. Decisions that puzzle, a focus that wavers. The eastern threat is met with hesitation, while loyal southern borders are stripped of their defenders. He turned his concerned eyes directly to the king. We, your loyal council, your people, we seek only reassurance, majesty, a sign that the hand on the shield remains steady. That the beast of war is caged and the mind of the king is clear. It was a public, polite, and utterly devastating challenge. He was using the king's own fabricated instability against him in front of the entire realm. He was asking Kaelin to prove his sanity. All eyes turned to the throne. Kaelin did not move for a long, agonizing moment, then he slowly stood. The air crackled. Ilara's pen froze. "You speak of my hand, Vesper," Kaelin said, his voice soft, yet it carried to the farthest corner. "You question its steadiness. You whisper of beasts and cages." He took a single step down from the dais, his movement fluid, predatory. "Tell me, my lord, when you look at your own hands, do you see the ink from the forged mine reports? Do you smell the smoke from the secret forges you bankroll?" The gasps in the hall were sharp, collective. Vesper's face went pale, his mask of concern slipping into shock. He hadn't expected this. This was not the reaction of a distracted, crumbling king. "Or you, General Burroughs," Kaelin continued, turning his molten gaze on the stunned general. "When you dream of glory in the Eastern Pass, do you see the faces of the men who would die there, based on the false numbers your ally provided?" He flicked a glance at Seraphine, who sat perfectly still, her face a beautiful, unreadable mask. Kaelin walked into the center of the hall now, a lone wolf circling its prey. "You speak of my beast, Vesper, but you have nurtured a cancer. You have fed a rebellion with my kingdom's own flesh. You ask for a sign of my strength." He stopped, and his voice dropped, becoming lethally quiet. "Here is my sign. I have seen your map. I have counted your hidden swords. I know the location of every traitorous cache, every whispered meeting." Panic flashed in Vesper's eyes. He looked desperately toward Seraphine. This was not part of the plan. The king was not supposed to know. It was Seraphine who rose now, her movement graceful, a contrast to the rising chaos. "Majesty," she said, her voice a silken blade, "these are grave, fantastical accusations, made without proof in a moment of clear agitation. This is precisely the instability we fear. Where is this proof? Where is this map?" It was the cue, the demand for evidence, the moment they would discredit him as a paranoid tyrant. Kaelin looked directly at Ilara. His gaze was a command. It was time. Every head in the hall swiveled to her. The quiet archivist with the moonstone around her neck, the king's chronicler, Seraphine's supposed pawn. Ilara's mouth was desert dry, her legs felt like water. She closed her ledger with a definitive thump that echoed. She did not stand. She simply looked at Seraphine, and her voice, when it came, was not the whisper of a mouse, but the clear, carrying tone of a scholar stating an irrefutable fact. "The proof, Lady Seraphine, is in the Vesper collection. Map 14b, the damaged survey of the Ironroot Valleys. The restoration fee of 50 gold crowns was not to fix faded ink. It was to pay master cartographer Valerius to create a hidden layer, revealed by a reagent of Xanthoria aureophila lichen extract." She paused, letting the highly specific, technical truth sink in. "The same extract, my lady, that you supplied to him. The map is real, the rebellion is real, and your hand is on every page of its ledger." The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and shattered a second later by Seraphine's shriek of pure, undiluted rage. "You lying little serpent, you wore my stone, you took my offer. I wore your stone," Ilara agreed calmly, though her heart was trying to escape her chest. She lifted the moonstone and let it drop to the floor, where it shattered with a sharp, crystalline sound. So you would believe the lie, so you would commit your treason in the open for all to see. Chaos erupted. Vesper was shouting orders to guards that did not move, guards whose loyalties Kaelin had secretly secured days before. Burroughs roared and reached for his sword, but a ring of the king's personal guard materialized around him, blades drawn. But Seraphine did not shout. In her eyes, the beautiful facade melted away, revealing a core of pure, venomous hatred. She looked not at the king, but at Alara. "You," she hissed, the word cutting through the din, "you insignificant speck of dust, you think you have won, you have only chosen the losing side." Her hand slipped into the folds of her gown. Kaelin saw it. Elara. The roar was not one of kingly command, but of raw, primal terror. He moved, a blur of black and silver, but he was too far away. From the shadows of a pillar behind Alara's seat, a man lunged, a nondescript servant she had seen a dozen times, now with an assassin's dead eyes and a thin, needle-like dagger aimed at the base of her skull. Seraphine's final move, a guarantee of mutually assured destruction. Time slowed. Alara saw the king's desperate leap, saw the cold triumph in Seraphine's eyes, saw the glint of the needle point. There was no fear in that crystalline moment, only a strange, clear thought: this is how the story ends. But the story was not over. From her left, a massive form collided with the assassin, not the king, General Burroughs. The bull-like alpha, his face a contorted mask of furious realization, smashed the smaller man into the stone wall with a sickening crunch. He had seen the map, heard the truth, and in that instant his loyalty, brutal and simple, snapped back to his king. He had been used, and he would not die a traitor's pawn. The dagger skittered across the floor. The assassin slumped, lifeless. Kaelin reached Alara, his body a shield between her and the rest of the hall, his chest heaving, his claws fully extended, a terrifying snarl ripping from his throat. But the threat was over. His guards had Vesper and Seraphine restrained. The Hall of Whispers was silent once more, but now it was the silence of aftermath, littered with the wreckage of broken plots and shattered lives. Kaelin turned to Alara, his golden eyes wild, scanning her for injury. His hand came up, hovering near her face, trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline and a fear greater than any battle. "You are unharmed." She could only nod, her own breath coming in short gasps. He looked past her to Burroughs, who stood over the body of the assassin, his own knuckles bleeding. A look passed between king and general, a harsh, unspoken acknowledgement, an alliance reforged in blood and betrayal. Then Kaelin turned his gaze to the assembled nobility, his voice returning, cold and absolute as a winter glacier. "Let the record show," he declared, his eyes finding Alara's for a brief, searing moment, that the treason was unveiled not by the king's roar, but by the chronicler's quiet truth. He looked at the captured conspirators, Lord Vesper, Lady Seraphine, for treason against the crown, for plotting civil war. "Your titles, lands, and fortunes are forfeit. You will be held for trial." His gaze was merciless. "There will be no quiet exile for you. The kingdom will know the full extent of your venom." As they were dragged away, Seraphine's final scream was not of anger, but of a prophecy. "It's not over, Kaelin. The quiet ones, they are the most dangerous. You have a viper in your nest, and you don't even know it." The doors boomed shut behind them. The ceremony was over. The war was won. Alara stood amidst the wreckage of the conspiracy, the scent of blood and incense in her nose, the king's protective presence at her side. The noise had reached its crescendo, and in its wake a new, fragile silence descended. But the words of the defeated viper echoed in the stillness, a last, poisonous gift. "You have a viper in your nest." The battle was over. But the echo of the serpent's hiss suggested the war for the king's trust might have just begun. Victory, Alara discovered, was not a clean, quiet thing. It was a cacophony of consequences. The days following the coup's unraveling were a whirlwind of tribunals, sealed testimonies, and the grim, necessary work of rooting out the last tendrils of the conspiracy from the fortress's walls. The silence she craved was filled with the sounds of justice being meted out, a colder, harder noise than the plotting that had preceded it. King Kaelin was everywhere and nowhere. He was a force of nature, personally overseeing the interrogations, reviewing the seized assets from Vesper's and Seraphine's estates, redeploying troops to secure the now exposed rebel caches. The Shadow Army was dismantled before it could ever march. The kingdom, it seemed, had been saved from the brink of civil war. Yet in the rare moments she saw him, passing in a corridor or across a crowded chamber, Elara saw a new tension in him. It wasn't the frayed, beast-threatened tension of before. It was the hypervigilance of a man who had looked into an abyss and seen not just enemies, but the architecture of his own betrayal. Seraphine's final shriek, "You have a viper in your nest," had planted a seed, and it was growing in the fertile soil of a king's paranoia. He did not summon her, he did not ask for her chronicles, the deep, nightly conversations in his study ceased. It was as if the tool, having served its purpose, had been set back on the shelf. The logical part of her understood, the crisis was over. The king had a kingdom to rebuild, but the part of her that remembered his touch on her cheek in the starlight, his promise of a shared quiet, that part felt a cold, lonely ache. Her official position remained, she was still the royal chronicler. But her duties were suddenly, bureaucratically reassigned to documenting the historical precedents for the traitors' trials, a safe, distant topic. She was given a new, larger chamber further from the North Tower. It felt less like a promotion and more like a gentle, definitive removal from the center of his world. The worst of it was the silence from the other side. The conspirators in their cells were refusing to speak. Vesper maintained a dignified, infuriating silence. Burroughs, now cooperating to save his own skin from the worst charges, knew only military details. But Seraphine had asked for one thing, parchment and ink, and she was writing voluminously. Rumors slithered through the court. She was writing confessions, she was writing manifestos, she was listing every co-conspirator, every secret, every sin. The speculation was a poison in itself. Who else would be named? The king's spymaster collected the pages each day, his face grim, delivering them directly to Kaelin. No one else saw their contents. Elara tried to lose herself in her new work, but the ancient texts felt hollow. She had tasted the living, breathing history of the present, and its dusty echoes held no thrill. She found herself standing at her new window, looking toward the distant, slender shape of the North Tower, wondering what words were flowing from the viper's pen in the dark, and what shadows they were casting in the king's mind. It was a week after the ceremony when the summons finally came, not to the study but to the king's justice hall, a stark, stone room used for private royal inquiry. The air was cold, smelling of damp stone and anxiety. Kaelin sat on a simple chair on a low dais, not a throne. He looked older, wearier, his eyes like chips of topaz in the gray light from a high, barred window. Before him on a table lay a stack of parchment, Seraphine's writings. Elara's heart stuttered. "Chronicler Vane," he said, his voice was formal, stripped of the low rumble she had come to know. "You have been instrumental in uncovering a great treason. Your service has been noted." It was a dismissal wrapped in praise. "Thank you for your service, you may go." "Your Majesty," she said, bowing her head, waiting for the blow she knew was coming. He didn't look at her, he looked at the papers. "The prisoner Seraphine has made many statements, wild accusations, fantastical claims." He finally lifted his gaze, and it was like being examined by a stranger. "Some of them concern you." The cold in the room seeped into Elara's bones. "My lord." "She claims," Kaelin said, picking up the top sheet, his voice devoid of emotion, "that your defection to her cause was not a ruse, that it was genuine, that you were, in fact, her masterpiece." a deep placement agent so perfectly crafted that even you believed your own loyalty to me." He read from the page, his tone flat. "The girl is a blank parchment. I wrote the fear upon her. I guided her hand. Every piece of information she fed you was designed to lead you into a different, deeper trap, one that is still set. She is the true map, Majesty, and you are reading it backwards." He set the paper down. The silence was crushing. Alara felt the world tilt. It was brilliant. It was diabolical. With a few elegant sentences, Seraphine had weaponized the very success of their plan. She had taken Alara's courage, her acting, her sacrifice, and retroactively painted it as the ultimate deception. She was ensuring that even in victory, the king would never know peace, that he would always look at the one person who had stood by him and see a phantom of doubt. "You know it's not true," Alara whispered, her voice breaking the terrible quiet. "Do I?" Kaelin asked, and the question was a knife. He stood, pacing slowly. "I know what I saw, I know what you did, but she is cunning. She plays the long game." What if the entire revelation was a gambit, a sacrifice of Vesper and Burroughs to plant you irreversibly at my right hand? What if the next plot requires you to be there, trusted, beloved? He stopped, his back to her. "The quiet ones are the most dangerous," she said. "And you are the quietest person I have ever known." The pain was so acute it was physical. It stole her breath. He was doing exactly what Seraphine wanted. He was pulling away, isolating himself, letting the poison of doubt erode the trust they had built. "I gave you the reagent," Alara said, forcing strength into her voice. "I stood before the entire court and denounced her. I almost died. Or it was the final, convincing act," he countered, still not looking at her. "A calculated risk to cement your position. Burroughs's intervention was unpredictable. Without it, you would be a martyr, and I would be a broken king grieving his lost chronicler, never suspecting the hand that guided the dagger." He turned, and his eyes were haunted. "Don't you see? It is the perfect lie because it can never be disproven. It will always be a possibility, a shadow in the corner of my eye." Alara stared at him, seeing the beast not of rage but of a profound, lonely suspicion. The king who feared nothing was terrified of the one thing he couldn't fight, a doubt in the heart of the person he had begun to trust. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood before the dais. She did not bow. She looked up at him, letting him see every ounce of her hurt, her frustration, her unwavering truth. "Then you have a choice, Kaelin Thorne," she said, his name leaving her lips for the first time, a quiet challenge in the judicial hall. "You can listen to the lies of a defeated viper, written in a cell of her own making, or you can listen to the silence we built together, the silence in the library, the silence in the strategy, the silence before the storm." Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "You asked me to find the truth in the lies. The deepest truth I found was not on a map, it was in the quiet between us. You can choose to believe her poison, or you can choose to believe in that." She held his gaze, her own eyes burning with unshed tears. "But you must choose, because I cannot live in the echo of a serpent's lie. And you cannot rule from a tower of your own suspicion." She didn't wait for a dismissal. She turned and walked out of the justice hall, leaving the king alone with the stack of poisonous parchment and the echoing silence of her final words. She had faced down traitors and assassins, but this was the hardest battle, fighting for a trust that had to be given freely, fighting a shadow with nothing but the light of her own constancy. The war for the kingdom was over. The war for the king's heart, it seemed, had just entered its most desperate, silent phase. The fortress held its breath. The trial of Lord Vesper and Lady Seraphine was to be a public spectacle, a performative purge to cauterize the wound of treason. The great hall was again filled, but the air was different, not with anticipatory conspiracy, but with a grim, fearful awe. The king's justice would be swift, the world would see, and order would be restored. Alara had not seen Kaelin since her outburst in the justice hall. She had been given a formal summons to attend the trial as a witness for the crown. It was a cold, official command. She dressed with numb fingers, choosing a simple, severe gown of charcoal gray. She would not wear the colors of the court. She would be a scribe. A ghost, a fact, her seat was in the witness gallery, separate from the nobility, separate from the king's dais. She was a piece of evidence to be called upon. She kept her eyes on her folded hands, feeling the weight of countless stares. The story of the quiet chronicler who had unmasked the plot was now legend, twisted and tangled with new, whispered rumors seeded by Seraphine's poison. Was she a hero, or was she a deeper plant? Did the king truly trust her? The prisoners were brought in. Vesper looked diminished, a husk of his former elegant self, his eyes avoiding everyone. Seraphine, however, was transcendent. Dressed in a plain white shift, her hair loose, she looked not like a condemned traitor but like a martyr, a priestess of some forbidden truth. Her eyes swept the crowd, and when they landed on Alara, they gleamed with a chilling, intimate knowledge. The king's justiciar read the charges: treason, conspiracy, corruption, attempted regicide. The evidence was presented: the decoded map, the testimonies of cartographer Valerius and a broken General Burroughs, the financial records Alara had helped untangle. It was an irrefutable tapestry of guilt. When it was time for the prisoners to speak in their defense, Vesper remained silent, accepting his fate with a shuddering dignity. Seraphine rose. She did not plead, she did not deny, she smiled. "I have already confessed," she said, her voice clear and melodic, filling the hall. "I have written pages and pages for the king's eyes alone, but here today I will confess this publicly." She turned her beatific smile directly toward the king's dais. Kaelin sat motionless, a statue of judgment, but Alara, from her angle, saw the white-knuckled grip on the arms of his throne. "I confess," Seraphine proclaimed, "to underestimating the depth of the game. I thought I was playing against a king. I did not realize I was playing against a pair." Her gaze slid to Alara, and the smile turned razor-sharp. The beast and his keeper, the roar and the hush, a fascinating dynamic, one I sought to understand, to emulate even. She took a step forward as if addressing an academy. "You see, the chronicler taught me a valuable lesson. True power is not in the loudest voice but in the most trusted whisper. So I whispered my confession. I filled pages with possibilities, with stories. And in doing so, I performed my final act of service to this kingdom." She looked back at Kaelin, her expression one of mock pity. "I have given you the gift of eternal vigilance, Majesty. I have ensured you will never again be blinded by trust. Every smile, every loyal word, every quiet presence at your side, you will now look at it and wonder, is this another one of Seraphine's whispers? Especially," she paused, dragging her eyes slowly, meaningfully back to Alara, the quietest presence of all, the one who was so perfectly positioned. The one whose loyalty was so dramatically proven, a masterpiece of deception if it were one, and how would you ever know? The hall was utterly silent, captivated by her theatrical ruin. She was burning her own life to the ground, but she was using the flames to cast a long, dark shadow over Alara's future. "So, I am guilty," Seraphine concluded, spreading her hands, "but my guilt is a mirror. And in it you will forever see the ghost of a doubt. That is my legacy, that is my victory." She sat down, serene, as if she had just delivered a blessing. The justiciar, shaken, moved to pronounce the sentence: death for both by beheading at dawn. But before the gavel could fall, King Kaelin stood. The entire assembly froze. The king never interrupted his own justiciar. He stepped down from the dais, his boots echoing in the silence. He did not look at Seraphine. He walked past her, past the guards, past the stunned nobility. He walked directly to the witness gallery. All eyes followed him. 1,000 breaths were held. He stopped before Alara's row. His gaze was fixed on her. In his eyes was a tempest, doubt, fear, memory, and a desperate, clawing need for certainty. Chronicler Vane, he said, his voice not the formal tone of the throne, but the low, rough rumble she remembered from the library, from the dark corridors, from the starlit balcony. You have heard the accusation, not from the justicar, but from the condemned. That you are a phantom of her creation, that your loyalty is a weapon aimed at my heart. He took a final step until he was looking down at where she sat. You told me I must choose, to believe her poison or to believe in the quiet. He extended his hand to her, palm up, an offer and a demand in one. It was not the hand of a king to a subject, it was something far more vulnerable. Stand, he commanded softly, stand before your king and before this realm. Do not speak to me of maps or reagents or strategies, there is only one question that matters now. Ilara's heart was a wild thing in her chest. The entire world had narrowed to his hand, his eyes, the unbearable weight of the moment. She uncurled her stiff fingers and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, real. He pulled her gently to her feet and led her out into the center of the great hall, turning to face the assembled court, with Seraphine a rapt audience of one. Look at them, Kaelin said to her, his voice for her alone, yet every ear strained to hear, and tell them who you are, not to me, to them. He was giving her the stage, he was forcing the issue into the blinding light. He was asking her to prove her truth not in secret, but in the most public crucible imaginable. It was a brutal, beautiful test. Seraphine had dealt in shadows and whispers, he was demanding sunlight and a shout. Ilara turned to face the sea of faces. She saw curiosity, suspicion, envy, hope. She saw Seraphine's gleeful, expectant stare. She felt the warmth of Kaelin's hand still holding hers, an anchor in a roaring sea. She took a deep, shaking breath, and when she spoke, her voice did not ring with defiance or practiced elegance. It was simply clear, it was the voice of a woman stating the deepest, simplest truth of her life. I am Ilara Vane, she said, and the hall was so quiet her every syllable was a bell. I was the head archivist of the Grand Athenaeum. I liked the silence. I loved the stories that silence held. She looked at the king, then back at the crowd. He was a noise in my library, a terrible, wonderful, world-breaking noise, and in asking him to be quiet, I found my own voice. Tears, unbidden, welled in her eyes, but her voice grew stronger. I am not a weapon, I am not a phantom, I am a keeper of truth, and the truth is I chose to stand with my king, not because he commanded it, not because I feared the storm. But because in the eye of that storm, I saw a man who was tired of the noise, a man who wanted peace as desperately as I did, and I believe I can help him find it. She turned fully to Kaelin then, her vision blurry, her heart laid bare. That is who I am, a woman who believes in the quiet after the roar. You can choose to see a viper in that, or you can choose to see a partner in peace. For a long, agonizing moment, he just looked at her, his golden eyes searching hers, seeing past the words to the raw, unguarded truth beneath. The court was a frozen tableau. Then King Kaelin Thorne did something no one in that hall had ever seen. He lifted their joined hands. He did not raise them in victory, he simply held them there, a bridge between two people for all to see. He looked over her head, his gaze finding Seraphine's. His voice, when it came, was the final, crushing verdict, more powerful than any sentence of death. You sought to plant a doubt, he said to his condemned enemy, his tone quiet, absolute. You failed. The only whisper I hear is the one we choose to make together, and it says enough. He looked back at Ilara, and the ghost of a true, weary, hopeful smile touched his lips. It was not a proclamation of love to the court, it was quieter than that, it was a promise, a recognition, the acceptance of her truth as his own. He turned to the justicar, proceed with the sentence, but the trial was already over. The real verdict had been rendered in the center of the floor, in the joining of two hands, in the choice to believe in the quiet over the poison. Seraphine's triumphant smile had vanished, replaced by a look of utter, defeated shock. Her final weapon had shattered against a shield she never understood, genuine, publicly declared trust. As the guards led the traitors away, the hall began to murmur, not with conspiracy but with a dawning, awestruck understanding. The king had not just defeated his enemies, he had, in full view of his kingdom, chosen his cornerstone, and Alara, her hand still in his, knew the noise was finally, truly beginning to fade. The war for the king's heart was over. And in the quiet that followed, a new story was waiting to be written. The silence after the trial was different. It was not the watchful quiet of suspicion, nor the hollow quiet of isolation. It was the deep, grateful quiet of a storm that has finally passed, leaving a washed-clean world in its wake. The sentence was carried out at dawn, a grim, necessary punctuation to the plot. With it, the last echo of the serpent's hiss seemed to vanish on the morning mist. Alara did not return to her distant chamber. Without a word being spoken, her things were quietly moved back to the antechamber beside the king's study in the north tower. It was not an order, it was an understanding. This was where she belonged. For days, a new rhythm established itself. Kaelin was buried in the practical work of kingship, redistributing lands, rewarding true loyalty, restructuring a council now missing two of its most poisonous heads. But he did it from his study, with the door open to her room. He would often pause, a scroll in hand, and ask for her perspective on a point of law or historical precedent. The questions were about governance, not treason. The quiet between them was no longer a tactical space, but a shared one. One evening, as a violet twilight settled over the fortress, he stood in the doorway. He held two plain wooden cups, steam curling from them. "Chamomile," he said, his voice a low rumble. "With honey, the healer says it is for rest." He held one out to her. "I find I do not like the quiet of this room when you are not in it." Alara took the cup, their fingers brushing. The warmth seeped into her hands. "Thank you." He leaned against the doorframe, sipping his own tea, looking at her with an expression that was still new, open, unguarded, contemplative. "The rebuild will take years," he said. "The distrust they sowed, it will linger in the corners. It will take more than executions to heal a kingdom." "It will take a new story," Alara said softly, looking into her tea, "one not written in whispers and hidden ink." He was silent for a moment. "Write it." She looked up startled. "Your Majesty, write the true story," he said, his golden eyes intent. "Not as a chronicle for my eyes, as a history for the kingdom, the full story of the silent conspiracy, the maps, the lies, the betrayal, and how it was uncovered, not by a king's rage but by a chronicler's quiet perseverance." A faint, wry smile touched his lips. "Let them see the value of a mind that prefers parchment to swords. Let them see that the greatest threats are often answered not with a roar but with truth." The enormity of the task, the trust it implied, stole her breath. It would be unprecedented. A royal history written by a living scholar about events so recent. "Let it be unprecedented," he said, a spark of his old defiance returning but softened now. "Let us build a new precedent, one of transparency, of trust. You are the only one who knows the whole tale. The only one I trust to tell it fairly." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "Will you do it?" It was more than a commission. It was a handing over of the kingdom's narrative, its healing. It was the ultimate affirmation of her place. She nodded, a profound sense of purpose settling over her. "I will." "Good." He pushed off the doorframe. "Start tomorrow. The archives are yours, any resource you need. The only command is this: be truthful, even about me, especially about me. The doubts, the fears, the moments the beast nearly won, let them see it all. A kingdom built on half-truths is a kingdom waiting to fall again." He finished his tea and set the cup on her desk. He started to leave, then stopped, turning back. The vulnerability she had seen at the trial was back in his eyes. "Alara, the quiet you spoke of, the one after the roar, I wish to learn it, but I am a poor student. I may still be loud." She met his gaze, a gentle, fearless warmth blooming in her chest. "Then I will be there," she said simply, "to remind you as often as you need." He held her eyes for a long, wordless moment, a world of understanding passing between them. Then he gave a single, slow nod and left, closing the door softly behind him. The next morning, Ilara returned to the Grand Athenaeum not as a fugitive or a pawn, but as the royal historian. The head archivist, her old superior, greeted her with a deep, respectful bow, his eyes wide. She was given a grand, sunlit scriptorium of her own, overlooking the courtyard where she had once dropped a white feather into the wind. She began to write. The words flowed not as dry record but as a narrative. She started not with the conspiracy, but with a library in the dead of night and a king who was a noise in the dark. She wrote of fear and ink-stained fingers, of coded maps and chemical keys, of the terrifying, exhilarating dance in the viper's nest. She wrote of General Barros's redemption, of Seraphine's brilliant, twisted malice, of the public choice in the Great Hall, and she wrote of Kalin. She wrote of his weariness, his strategic rage, his moments of very human fear. She wrote of the beast not as a monster, but as a burden. She wrote of the king who longed for silence. Days turned into weeks. Kalin would often visit, not to oversee, but to listen. He would sit in a chair by the window, saying nothing as she read passages aloud. Sometimes he would correct a detail of strategy. Sometimes he would simply close his eyes, listening to the story of his own salvation being woven into words. One afternoon she was reading a passage about the aftermath of the trial, about the quiet return to the North Tower. She glanced up and saw he was asleep, his head leaning against the stone wall, the lines of tension finally smooth from his face. In that moment he looked not like a king but like a man at peace. She stopped reading. She simply watched him, this force of nature held still by the story of his own life. The sun warmed the room, dust motes danced in the light, and the only sound was his slow, even breathing. This was it. This was the quiet after the roar. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of peace. It was the sound of a kingdom healing, of a trust being rebuilt word by word, of a fearsome king finding rest in the space her truth created. She looked down at the parchment before her, at the last line she had written. And in the silence they had won together, they began to hear the future, not as a threat but as a promise. She set down her quill. There was no need to write more today. The story was living itself around her. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and simply listened to the new, gentle, precious silence. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever known. The first draft of the silent conspiracy, a true account, was completed as autumn painted the mountains in fiery hues. Ilara presented the bound manuscript to the king not in the great hall, but in the small, sun-drenched scriptorium where it had been born. The weight of the pages in her hands felt like the weight of the past season, terrifying, triumphant, and finally, resolved. Kalin took it, his fingers brushing the plain leather cover. He did not open it immediately. He held it, his expression solemn. "This is your truth," he stated. "And yours," she replied. He finally opened to a random page, his eyes scanning her neat, precise script. He read in silence for a long minute, his face unreadable. Then he flipped to another section, then another. He stopped at her account of his own doubt in the justice hall, her description of the beast of suspicion in his eyes. He read it slowly, his jaw tight. Ilara's heart thudded. Would he see it as a betrayal, an exposure of weakness? He closed the book with a soft thump. He looked out the window for a long moment, then back at her. His eyes were not angry. They were clear and deeply weary. "It is accurate," he said, his voice rough. "It is painful to see oneself so laid bare, but it is true." He placed a hand flat on the cover. "This will be copied. It will be sent to every major library, every lord's hall, every scholar's guild. Let the truth be as weaponized as the lies were. Let it be the shield." He stood, holding the book. "There is to be a ceremony, the official end of the summit and the beginning of the rebuilding. I would have you there. Not as a chronicler in the corner, not as a witness, as the author of this." He lifted the manuscript slightly. as the one who gave our victory its voice. The ceremony was held in the fortress's inner courtyard under the open sky. It was smaller than the grand closing gala, but more potent. The attendees were those who had remained loyal, the generals and lords who had passed the test of fire. There was a sense of hard-won solidarity in the air. Ilara stood at the edge of the gathering, feeling strangely detached. She was wearing a gown of deep blue, the color of twilight, a gift from the king's steward with no note attached. She felt like a character from her own book stepping off the page. King Kaelin stood on a simple wooden platform. He spoke without grandeur, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. He spoke of loyalty tested and proven, of a sickness purged from the kingdom's heart, of the work ahead. Then he paused. "But victory is a hollow word if its lessons are forgotten," he said, his gaze finding Ilara in the crowd. "We were nearly undone not by an army, but by a story woven in secret, designed to divide and corrupt. So our greatest weapon in rebuilding must be a different story, one of light, not shadow." He held up the leather-bound manuscript. "This is that story, the silent conspiracy, written by royal historian Ilara Vane, who lived its every moment. Within these pages is our failure, our fear, our perseverance, and our truth. It is unflinching, it names names, it reveals my own doubts." A murmur rippled through the crowd, because a kingdom that cannot face its own reflection is a kingdom already blind. "Copies will be distributed to all. Read it, know what we faced, and know how we stood." He stepped down from the platform and walked directly to her. The crowd parted silently. He stopped before her, and in front of everyone, he handed her the book. "This is your work, Historian Vane," he said, his voice formal, yet his eyes held a private warmth. "The first chapter of our new history. Do you consent to its sharing?" She took the book, her fingers steady now. "I do, Your Majesty." "For the truth deserves no seal but that of open air." He nodded, a satisfied glint in his eye, then he turned back to the assembly. "Let it begin." As the ceremony dissolved into more informal discussions, Ilara felt a hand on her arm. It was General Burroughs. He looked older, his bluster replaced by a gruff, weathered dignity. He bowed his head to her, a gesture from an alpha to an omega that was unheard of. "Your book," he grunted. "It says I was a proud fool, used." He met her gaze, his own surprisingly clear. "It is the truth. I read the draft the king showed me. It is harder to face than any battlefield, but necessary." He cleared his throat. "Thank you for not making me a villain, for letting me be a fool who remembered his duty in time." Before she could respond, he bowed again and moved away. Ilara stood holding the book, stunned. This was the power of the truth she had written. It wasn't just exposing enemies, it was offering redemption, forging a new understanding. Later, as the autumn sun began to sink, she found herself by the old fountain in the courtyard. Kaelin found her there, having shed the ceremonial cloak. "It is done," he said, coming to stand beside her, looking at the play of light on the water. "The sharing, yes," she replied. "The living with it, that begins now." He was quiet for a moment. "They will dissect it. They will debate my weakness, your audacity, Seraphine's brilliance. They will second-guess every decision. Yes, it will make me vulnerable. Yes." He turned to her. "And you are not afraid?" She met his gaze. "I am afraid of many things, but I am not afraid of the truth anymore. It is the only ground solid enough to build a future on. You taught me that." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming the harsh lines into something warm, real. "I taught you. I believe Historian Vane, the ledger shows the education flowed quite firmly in the other direction." The use of her title was playful, intimate. It made her breath catch. He grew serious again, looking down at her with an intensity that made the world fade. "The noise is gone, Ilara. The conspiracies, the immediate threats, they are silenced. But a king's life is never quiet. There will always be another crisis, another demand, another roar on the horizon." He took a small step closer. "I find I do not wish to face those future noises alone. I find I need the quiet beside me, not as a chronicler, not as a historian, but as a partner, in silence and in storm. Her heart stopped, then began to beat a frantic, joyous rhythm. This was not a proposal of royalty, it was something more profound, it was a request for a shared life. "Kaelin," she whispered, his name a prayer on her lips. He reached out not for her hand, but to gently touch the spine of the book she still held. "You wrote our past, will you help me write our future? A story not of kings and chroniclers, but of two people who found peace in the same quiet space." Tears, bright and happy, filled her eyes. She didn't need grandeur, she needed this. This quiet question in a courtyard at dusk, this man who had learned to listen. She placed her hand over his where it rested on the book. "Yes," she said, the words simple, final, and full of every promise she had ever wanted to make. "But only if I get to write that story, too." He laughed then, a rich, warm, unburdened sound that was better than any silence. He leaned his forehead against hers, a gesture of pure, equal connection. "Then it will be the most truthful story ever told," he murmured. And as the last light of day gilded the fortress towers, the king and his historian stood together by the fountain, not in a triumph of power, but in the quiet, unbreakable victory of trust. The final seal on the past was not wax or decree, but this simple, shared touch. And the first page of their new story had just begun. The wedding was not a grand spectacle. It was held in the same courtyard, under a canopy of woven autumn branches and the last of the golden leaves. There were no delegations from rival kingdoms, no displays of obscene wealth. The guests were the survivors, loyal soldiers with neatened uniforms, steadfast council members, archivists from the Athenaeum who looked upon Alara with awe, and General Burroughs who stood as Kaelin's witness with a gruff, solemn pride. Alara wore a gown the color of a winter sky at first light, simple and unadorned. Kaelin wore his formal black but without the crown of obsidian. Instead, a slender silver circlet rested on his brow, an ancient piece from the vaults, one worn by kings in times of peace-building. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. They spoke their own vows, not the traditional, lengthy pledges of dynasty and duty. Alara's voice was clear as a mountain stream in the hushed space. "I vow to be your truth," she said, her eyes locked with his. "To see you not as a king first, but as a man, to honor the quiet between us and to stand beside you when the world demands a roar. I offer you my silence, my clarity, and my unwavering heart." Kaelin's hands held hers, his thumbs gently stroking her knuckles. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant promise that vibrated in the very air. "I vow to be your shelter," he said, the words raw and heartfelt, "to listen for your voice above all others. To build a kingdom where your quiet is not a weakness but our greatest strength. I offer you my loyalty, my protection, and a lifetime of learning to be still." When the officiant declared them bound, Kaelin did not kiss her. It was a conscious, beautiful choice they had made together, a testament to the hallow nature of their union, built on profound respect and intellectual communion. Instead, he lifted their joined hands and pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of ultimate connection and shared breath. The crowd did not cheer, they released a collective, soft sigh of approval, a sound like the wind through peaceful trees. Their reign began not with conquest but with consultation. The king's council was reformed. Alara, now queen consort and royal archivist, had a seat at the table. Her voice was sought not just on matters of record, but on law, on education, on the allocation of resources for the common people. She established public libraries in every major town, stocked with copies of the Silent Conspiracy and other works of history and science. Knowledge, she argued, was the true antidote to the poison of secret plots. Kaelin governed with a new, tempered strength. The beast was not gone, it was a part of him, but it was no longer a tyrant ruling his soul. It was a guardian, summoned only when true, external threat demanded it. His people began to speak of the quiet king, not with disrespect, but with a deep, abiding reverence. He was a ruler who thought before he acted, who listened more than he spoke. Their private life was their sanctuary. Evenings were often spent in the royal study, now their study. He would work on state documents while she curated the royal archives or wrote her own treatises. The silence was companionable, rich. Sometimes he would read a proposed law aloud for her opinion. Sometimes she would share a fascinating passage from an ancient text. It was a partnership of minds, a continual, quiet conversation. One winter night, a fierce blizzard howled outside, sealing the fortress in a world of white noise. A fire crackled in the hearth. Ilara was restoring a water-damaged journal from a past queen, her touch gentle on the fragile pages. Kalen watched her from his armchair, a report on the secure southern mines forgotten in his lap. "You are staring," she said softly, without looking up, a smile playing on her lips. "I am listening," he corrected, his voice a warm rumble in the cozy room. She glanced up. "To what? I'm not speaking." "To the silence," he said. "Your silence, it has a different sound now. It is not the silence of fear or of hiding. It is the silence of contentment. It is the most peaceful sound I know." She set down her tools and looked at him fully, her heart swelling with a love so profound it was almost a physical ache. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night in the library? The challenge?" He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his eyes. "I believe I said, make me." She stood and walked to him, taking the report from his hands and placing it on a side table. She then took his face gently in her hands, her touch as sure as it was with the ancient parchment. She looked into the golden depths of his eyes, seeing the king, the man, the wolf, and her partner, all one and all at peace. "I don't need to make you be quiet anymore, Kalen," she whispered, her voice full of love and triumph. "You have found the silence within yourself. And I have found my voice within it. We built this quiet kingdom together, and its story is just beginning." He covered her hands with his own, leaning into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment in pure, unguarded gratitude. The storm raged impotently outside. But inside their sanctuary, there was only the crackle of the fire, the rhythm of their shared breath, and a quiet so deep, so complete it echoed with the music of a future built on trust, truth, and a love that had begun with a single impossible command. And if you'd like to give an extra boost of support to our creative team, you can also send a super thanks. It helps us continue bringing you stories like this.